Dad remarried and left me with Grandma when I was 5. Now my stepmom is demanding my inheritance, but Grandma is standing her ground, saying no. I'm 25 now, working full-time, and still living with my grandma. I've been with her for as long as I can remember. My mum passed away when I was really little, so it's always just been me and my grandparents. My dad disappeared soon after my mum died. I was only 5 when he left me with my grandparents and vanished. No siblings, no one else to rely on, just my grandma and grandpa. I used to ask all the time when Dad was coming back, but Grandma would always give me this sad smile and say not to worry. Eventually I understood he wasn't coming back. So yeah, it's been just the 3 of us for as long as I can remember. My grandparents were in their 50s when they took me in. They weren't wealthy, but they were the best. They made sure I never felt like I was missing out. I wasn't spoiled, but they made sure I had everything I needed. They worked hard to give me a good life. Grandma was tough, always working different jobs, whether it was at the local grocery store or cleaning houses. She never complained, always smiling and looking after me. I still remember how proud I was when I started school. Grandma had saved up enough to buy me a little backpack with cartoon characters on it. It was bright pink, and I wore it everywhere, even when I wasn't in school. I wore it out in just a month from carrying it around so much. I know it wasn't easy for them to afford those little things, but they always found a way. That's just how they were. As I got older, I began to realize just how hard they were working to hold everything together. Grandpa had a regular job at the post office before he got sick. He didn't say much, but I could tell he loved me. He wasn't one to show it with words, but I'd catch him sneaking candy into my lunchbox or letting me stay up late to watch TV when Grandma wasn't looking. Those were his ways of showing he cared. By the time I hit high school, things were getting more complicated. School was everything to me. I was always good with schoolwork, studying, doing homework, all of that. I had this dream of going to a really good high school, not just any public school, but one of the best. It felt like my way out of our situation, like I needed to make something of myself to make all their sacrifices worth it. I still remember this one dinner I had with Grandma when I was in middle school. We were sitting at the table, and she casually said, "You know, Jenny, don't worry too much about where you go to high school. Pick the one you like." At the time, I didn't really understand what she meant, but now I get it. She was worried about money. Private schools were expensive, and even though they never said it outright, I knew they were struggling. I asked her, "But what about you and Grandpa? Won't it be tough if I go to a private school?" She just smiled and shook her head, saying, "We'll manage. We've got some savings." That's how she always was, trying to make everything seem okay, even when it wasn't. But I wasn't oblivious. I knew they were doing everything for me. So, I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't let them spend money they didn't have. I decided I was going to work hard and get into the best public high school I could. I studied like crazy late nights, early mornings, flashcards everywhere. When the entrance exam came, I nailed it. I got into one of the best public high schools around. I'll never forget the look on my grandparents' faces when I told them. My grandpa, who barely ever spoke, got up from his chair and gave me a big, tight hug. I think it was the first time I ever saw him cry. They were so proud of me. It was the first time I really felt like I was doing something right, like I was paying them back for everything they had done for me. Grandpa even made a reservation at a nice restaurant in town to celebrate. We didn't do things like that often, so it was a big deal. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world that day. But high school wasn't all perfect. A couple of years in, things started to change. I'd come home, and the house felt different, like there was a cloud hanging over everything. One day, I walked into the kitchen and saw Grandma sitting at the table, her head in her hands. I asked her what was wrong, and she looked up at me with tired eyes and said, "Grandpa's sick." I didn't know what to say. How could I? I was just a teenager. At first, I didn't understand how serious it was, but things got bad, really bad. Grandpa was in and out of the hospital, and every time he came home, he looked worse. He had to stop working, and Grandma had to pick up more hours at her jobs just to keep everything going. I felt so helpless. There was nothing I could do to fix it. I tried to keep up with school, but it was hard to concentrate when all I could think about was what was happening at home. I stayed up late studying, but my mind was always on Grandpa and Grandma. Grandma was always so strong, but I could see the cracks. She was exhausted. Some days she'd come home from work, sit on the couch, and just stare at the wall for what felt like forever before finally getting up to make dinner. I started helping out more, cooking, cleaning, doing whatever needed to be done. I didn't want her to worry about me on top of everything else. She'd always tell me, "Don't worry, Jen. Focus on your school. You've got a bright future ahead," but how could I focus on school when everything around me was falling apart? Grandpa's condition kept getting worse. It was like a slow, painful decline. One day he'd seem okay, and the next he'd be back in the hospital. I hated it. I hated it. I hated seeing him like that. I hated seeing Grandma so worn out, and I hated that there was nothing I could do to make it better. That's when it really hit me: life wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fair, and it definitely wasn't going to be what I expected. Things only got worse after Grandpa's diagnosis. It was no longer something I could ignore, and honestly, I didn't want to anymore. Every time I stepped into the house, it felt heavier, like this weight I couldn't shake. Grandpa wasn't just sick, he was deteriorating quickly, and I didn't know how to handle it. I was a teenager, and I had never experienced watching someone I loved slowly fade away like that. Grandma tried her best to hold it together, but I could see the strain. She didn't complain, but she didn't have to. It was written all over her. There were days when she'd come home from work, her shoulders slumped, like she was carrying the weight of the world. She'd smile at me, ask about my day at school, and go through the motions of making dinner like she always did, but it wasn't the same. We both knew it. Grandpa was in and out of the hospital so much that I lost track of the appointments. Sometimes he'd be there for a week, other times just a few days, but each time he came home, he looked worse. It felt like watching him disappear bit by bit. He had always been this strong, quiet figure, and now he was frail, exhausted, barely able to get out of bed most days. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I was just a kid. Grandma was the one holding everything together, or at least trying to. She picked up even more part-time jobs. It wasn't just about covering the bills anymore. There were hospital expenses, medications, and despite Grandpa having insurance, it didn't cover everything. I didn't fully grasp the financial strain back then, but I knew we were struggling. Late at night, I'd hear her on the phone, talking with the hospital, trying to negotiate payment plans, sometimes even arguing. I tried to step up where I could, cooking dinner if she was late, cleaning the house, doing laundry, anything that might lighten her load. I even got a part-time job at the local store to contribute a little extra money. It wasn't much, but it was something. Still, no matter what I did, it never felt like enough, and honestly, it wasn't. How could it be? The hardest part was watching Grandpa. After school, I'd go straight to his room to check on him. Some days he'd be asleep. Other days he'd be sitting up, trying to pretend everything was normal. He'd tell me stories or try to crack jokes, but even that was fading. I'll never forget one particular day. I walked into his room, and he gave me this weak smile and said, "Jenny, I'm sorry I didn't know how to respond." Sorry for what? For being sick. For not being the grandpa I remembered. I just sat there, holding his hand, not knowing what to say, because what could I say? Nothing I could say would fix anything. As time went on, things only got more difficult. Grandpa had retired by then, and it was all on Grandma to keep us afloat. I could see how exhausted she was, but she wouldn't admit it. She'd always say, "Don't worry, Jenny, I'm fine." But she wasn't. She was running herself ragged, and I knew it. There were days when she'd come home from work, and I could tell she had been crying, though she'd never admit it. That wasn't her way. Then there was the hospital. It felt like every other day there was a new complication with Grandpa's health. The doctors would explain things, but I didn't understand half of what they said. All I knew was that it wasn't good. One night, Grandma and I went to visit him, and he was hooked up to all these machines. He was barely conscious, and when he saw us, he tried to smile but couldn't. That's when it really hit me: he wasn't going to get better. I didn't know how to handle that realization. How do you prepare for losing someone who's been a constant presence in your life, even if they weren't the loud, talkative type? It felt like my entire foundation was crumbling. At school, I tried to focus, tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. My friends didn't understand. They'd ask, "How's your grandpa?" and I'd just say, "He's okay," because what else could I say? None of them were dealing with anything like this. They were worried about grades and weekend plans, while I was worrying whether Grandpa would make it through the night. Grandma started talking about applying for government assistance. We had always managed on our own, but now we needed help. I didn't know much about how that worked, but I could tell Grandma didn't want to do it. She was proud, and asking for help went against her nature, but we didn't have a choice. I remember the day she went to the city office to apply. She came home with a huge stack of forms she had to fill out, and I could see the frustration in her eyes. "It's confusing," she said, sitting at the table, staring at the paperwork. I sat down with her and helped as much as I could, but it was overwhelming. Eventually we got through it, and a few weeks later, we were approved. I thought it would make things easier, but it didn't. It just made everything feel more real. We were officially on assistance, and that felt like a loss in itself. As Grandpa's condition worsened, the toll on Grandma became more apparent. She was still working, still doing everything she could, but it wasn't enough. It never seemed like enough. One night, after Grandpa had another bad episode, she broke down. I had never seen her like that. She sat at the kitchen table, hands covering her face, and cried. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't, because I didn't believe it myself. We were running on empty, and no matter how hard we tried, it felt like we were sinking deeper. I was scared for Grandpa, scared for Grandma, and honestly, scared for myself. What would happen if we lost him? How would we manage? These questions swirled around in my mind, but there were no answers. Then, one day, after Grandpa had been in the hospital for a few days, we got the call. I don't remember who answered, but I remember the silence that followed, the kind of silence where you just know something terrible has happened. Grandpa had passed away. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, numb, like my brain couldn't process it. He was gone, just like that, and with him went all the hope that maybe, somehow, he'd get better. That evening, Grandma sat beside me on the couch. She didn't say much, just held my hand, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like a child again, a scared, lost kid who had no idea what the future held. After Grandpa passed, everything felt off. The house was too quiet, too empty. He had been ill for a long time, but somehow we always believed he would come home again. When that didn't happen, both Grandma and I felt adrift. We didn't talk about it, but the way we avoided certain rooms and stayed busy said it all. I threw myself into work. By then, I had graduated high school and put off college to stay and help at home. There was no way I was going to leave Grandma alone, not after everything she had done for me. So I found a full-time job at a local store. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped pay the bills, and that's what we needed at the time. But Grandma, she was the one I worried about. She didn't complain, she never did. But I could see the exhaustion in her. She was still working her part-time jobs, even after all we'd been through, and I knew she felt guilty. One day, I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills like they might leap off the table and attack her. I sat down across from her. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She sighed and shook her head. "It's these bills, Jenny. We're managing, but barely. I'm just so tired." I didn't know what to say. I was tired too, but I wasn't going to mention that. I had to step up. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'm working full-time now, remember? We'll get through this." She gave me a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're too young to be worrying about bills. This isn't the life I wanted for you." That hit me hard. I could see the guilt she carried, like she had somehow failed me. But I didn't feel that way. She and Grandpa had raised me, given me everything they could. Now, it was my turn to help them, or at least Grandma. "Grandma, you did everything for me. I wouldn't be where I am without you and Grandpa. Don't think for a second this is your fault." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. From that point on, I made it my mission to work harder, take on extra shifts, do whatever I could to ease her burden. It wasn't easy, but it was what I had to do. A few months passed, and we fell into a routine: work, bills, sleep, repeat. It wasn't much of a life, but it was ours. Then, out of nowhere, we got a phone call. It was strange because no one ever called us. I answered, and on the other end was a woman I didn't recognize. "Hello, is this Jennifer?" she asked. "Yeah, who's this?" I responded. There was a pause before she said, "I'm your father's wife." My stomach dropped. My father? I hadn't heard from him in, 20 years, and now all of a sudden his wife was calling me? I didn't even know he had gotten married. "Okay," I said slowly, unsure of what to expect. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your father passed away in a car accident." I didn't feel anything. What was I supposed to feel? This man had abandoned me as a kid, and now I was expected to care that he was dead. I kept my voice steady as I said, "I see." She kept talking, something about the accident, the funeral. It all blurred together. I wasn't really paying attention. That is, until she mentioned something about an inheritance. That snapped me back into focus. "Inheritance," I repeated. "Yes," she said, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "He left behind some assets, and as his biological child, you have a claim to them." I was confused. This man hadn't been part of my life for years, and suddenly I was entitled to his money. It didn't feel real. I didn't even want anything from him. Why would I? Then she said something that really set me off. "Would you consider giving up your inheritance rights? It would make things easier for us. I mean, for me. We don't have any children, and your claim complicates things." I couldn't believe it. She didn't even try to hide what this was really about. It wasn't about my father's memory or closure or anything like that. It was about money. And not for me, but for her. She wanted me to just walk away, pretend I didn't exist, so she could have it all. "No," I said firmly. There was a pause. "No." "That's right," I said, my voice stronger now. "I'm not giving up anything. I didn't even know about this inheritance, but now that I do, I'm not just going to give it up because it's convenient for you." She didn't like that answer. "But you didn't even have a relationship with him. What difference does it make to you?" That hit a nerve. "You're right," I said. "I didn't have a relationship with him. He left me with my grandparents and disappeared. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve what's rightfully mine." I could hear her fuming on the other end of the line. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "I don't care if it's fair to you," I snapped back. "He was my father, whether he acted like it or not, and I have a right to whatever he left behind." She hung up. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't thought about my father in years, and now his death was bringing all this drama into my life. I told Grandma about the call, and she wasn't surprised. "I always knew your father was selfish," she said. "But this, trying to take everything for herself, that's low, even for him." We decided to consult a lawyer just to be sure of what we were dealing with. I didn't know how much money was involved, but that wasn't the point. After everything we had been through, I wasn't about to let someone who didn't even know me take something that, for once, was supposed to be mine. After the phone call with my father's wife, things escalated quickly. It wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It became this strange battle between me, someone who hadn't seen her father in over 2 decades, and his second wife, who clearly wanted everything for herself. I wasn't being greedy, but the way she demanded I give up my rights without even a real conversation rubbed me the wrong way, so I stood my ground. The first thing I did after talking to Grandma was call the family lawyer. He was actually a cousin of ours, and though I hadn't seen him much growing up, Grandma swore by him. She called him a straight shooter, which basically meant he didn't mess around. I liked that. I didn't want drama, I just wanted to know my rights and where I stood. A few days later, I sat down with him, and he walked me through everything. My dad had left behind a decent amount of assets, some savings, property, and a few investments. It wasn't like he was rich, but it was more than I expected from someone who had ghosted me for most of my life. The thing that really hit me was how much of a surprise all of this was. I had no idea about his life after he left. The lawyer explained that my dad's second wife had been living comfortably, and now that he was gone, she wanted to keep everything. "So, what do?" I asked, feeling a bit out of place in the lawyer's stuffy office. I didn't know anything about legal matters, especially something like inheritance. This wasn't exactly something they taught in school. "Well," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses and flipping through some papers, "you have a claim to half of your father's assets. As his biological child, you're entitled to that, unless you choose to waive your rights." I shook my head. "I'm not waiving anything." He smiled slightly. "I didn't think so. But the other side, your father's wife, is likely to contest it. This could get complicated." I didn't care if it got messy. I wasn't going to let her push me out of what was rightfully mine. But I also had to think of Grandma. She was still recovering from everything with Grandpa, and I didn't want to drag her into a legal fight. When I talked to her about it, though, she was all in. "You deserve this, Jenny," she said firmly. "After everything you've been through, don't let that woman take what's yours." And that was it. We were moving forward. The lawyer filed the necessary paperwork, and before long my father's wife's lawyer contacted mine. She wasn't happy about me staking a claim and was ready for a fight. I tried not to let it get to me, but it was hard not to. Every day I'd come home from work wondering if there'd be another call, another piece of paperwork, something else to deal with. It started to take over my thoughts, which I guess is just how legal stuff goes. Then, one day there was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Grandma was out running errands. I opened the door, and there she was, my father's wife, standing right on my doorstep. "Can we talk?" she asked, looking worn out, like the whole situation had been weighing on her. I didn't really want to, but I figured I'd hear her out. "All right," I said, stepping aside to let her in. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where Grandma and I had discussed everything just weeks before. It felt strange, like I was letting the enemy into my space, but I was curious about what she had to say. "I know this must be strange for you," she started, fidgeting with her hands. "You didn't have a relationship with your father, so why are you pushing this?" Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was clear she was trying to make me feel guilty. I wasn't falling for it. "I didn't have a relationship with him because he left me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I don't have a right to what he left behind." She sighed. "But I was his wife. I was there for him when no one else was." "I'm not saying you don't deserve something," I replied, "but I'm his daughter, and I'm not giving up my rights just because it's inconvenient for you." Her face tightened. "Inconvenient? You have no idea what this has been like for me, losing him, dealing with all of this, and now this inheritance battle. You don't even need the money." But that made my blood boil. How did she know what I needed? She didn't know my life or the struggles Grandma and I had been through. "You don't know what I need," I said firmly. "This isn't just about money, it's about what's fair." She didn't like that answer, but she didn't argue as much as I thought she would. Instead, she just looked tired. "I just want this to be over," she muttered. "Well, it'll be over when we settle this properly," I said, not backing down. "I'm not giving in just to make things easier for you." There was a long silence. She stared down at the table, clearly trying to figure out her next move, but whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself. After a few more minutes of awkward quiet, she stood up. "I hope you reconsider," she said, her voice flat like she already knew I wouldn't. I didn't say anything as she walked out the door. I just stood there, feeling this weird mix of anger and confusion. I didn't want to fight with her, but I wasn't going to let her push me around either. When Grandma got home, I told her about the visit. She just shook her head. "She's desperate," Grandma said, "but don't let that sway you. You're doing the right thing." I hoped she was right. I didn't like how things were unfolding, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of me, not now, not ever again. After the visit from my dad's wife, things only got more complicated. The legal stuff was already underway, and I knew we weren't backing down. I didn't hear from her again directly, but her lawyer sure kept mine busy. My lawyer started receiving aggressive letters from her side, pushing for a quick settlement, basically trying to get me to give up. But I wasn't budging. Still, the situation was wearing me down. I wasn't sleeping well, and every time the phone rang, I felt a knot in my stomach, worrying it was more drama about the inheritance. Grandma kept telling me to stay strong, but I could see she was getting worn out too. Every day seemed to bring a new letter or request from their lawyer, trying to pressure me into backing off, and I started to feel like I was stuck in a never-ending battle. Then, out of nowhere, my lawyer called me one afternoon while I was at work. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice tense. My stomach dropped. "What now?" I asked, bracing for the worst. "They're contesting your claim," he explained. "She's saying that your father didn't want you to get anything, that he wanted it all to go to her, but just never got around to putting it in writing." I was stunned. "What? How can she say that? There's no will that says that, right?" He sighed. "Right, but she's claiming that was his intent, even though he never formalized it." I couldn't believe it. It felt like every time I thought things were calming down, they found a new way to stir the pot. "So what do we do now?" I asked, more frustrated than anything. "We fight it," he said matter-of-factly. "She can claim whatever she wants, but unless she has solid proof, it's not going to hold up in court. It's just a scare tactic." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Every step of this process was dragging on, making everything more tiring. But weeks passed, and we kept going back and forth with their lawyers. At one point, They even tried to claim I wasn't really his daughter. Yeah, seriously, they were that desperate to get me out of the picture. I couldn't believe the lengths they were going to just to keep me from what was mine. I remember sitting down with Grandma one evening, feeling completely drained. I don't even know why I'm doing this anymore, I admitted, slumping on the couch. Grandma gave me a look, like she knew exactly how I was feeling. You're doing this because it's the right thing, Grandma said firmly. Don't let them push you out of what's yours. Just because your father wasn't in your life doesn't mean you don't deserve your share. She was right, but it was hard to stay focused on that when it felt like the battle would never end. Still, I pressed on. We filed the necessary responses, attended meetings, and just kept moving forward. Then one day, my lawyer called with surprising news. They're offering a settlement, he said, sounding almost shocked. A settlement, I echoed, unsure if I had heard correctly. What kind of settlement? They're willing to split everything 50-50, he explained. No more contests. They'll drop all their claims, and you'll get half of the estate. I was speechless. After all the back and forth, they were finally ready to settle. I didn't know what to think at first. Part of me wondered if I should have held out for more, but another part of me was just relieved that this whole ordeal might finally be over. What do you think? I asked him. I think it's a fair deal, he said. It's what you were entitled to from the start, and it's better than dragging this out in court for another year. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace. Okay, let's do it. When I told Grandma about the settlement, she looked as relieved as I felt. I'm proud of you, she said with a smile. You stood your ground. That's what matters. And just like that, it was done. The paperwork was finalized, and within a few weeks, the estate was officially divided. I didn't feel triumphant, though. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted after carrying it for months. We got our portion of the inheritance, enough to pay the bills, put some money away, and most importantly allow Grandma to finally retire from all the part-time jobs she had been working. That was the best outcome of all. She no longer had to struggle, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything would be okay. After everything was settled, I thought about my dad. It was hard to believe how it had all unfolded. He wasn't part of my life, hadn't been there for me or Grandma, but in the end, he left something behind. Whether he meant for me to have it or not didn't matter anymore. I had my family, my real family, who had always been there. Watching Grandma finally rest after years of hard work made me realize that we had made the right choice. It was never about the money, it was about standing up for ourselves, about not letting anyone take advantage of us. My dad's wife might have wanted it all, but in the end we got what we deserved, and that was enough for me. Update. It's funny how life changes after the storm settles. When the inheritance battle ended, life moved on in its own quiet way. I thought I would feel different, like I'd have this big moment of relief, and I did, just not in the way I expected. After receiving our share of the estate, I focused on making sure Grandma was comfortable. That had always been my goal, to give her the peace and security she deserved after all the years of hard work, especially after Grandpa got sick. Now, she didn't have to worry about money anymore, and that alone made the stress and the fights worth it. But once everything was resolved, I found myself feeling a little empty. It was strange. I had spent so much time fighting, dealing with lawyers, and thinking about my dad and his wife, that when it was over, I didn't really know what to do with myself. Part of me had always expected some sort of closure. Maybe I'd get answers about why my dad left or learn more about his life after he disappeared. But none of that came. There was no grand revelation, no missing piece of the puzzle. He was just gone, and that was the end of it. One evening, Grandma and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. It was one of those quiet moments where neither of us needed to speak, but I knew we were both thinking about everything that had happened. You did good, Jenny, she said suddenly, her voice soft but certain. I smiled at her. Thanks, Grandma. She nodded, then said something I wasn't expecting. It's time for you to start thinking about yourself now. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long, but you've got a whole life ahead of you. I didn't know what to say. She was right, of course. I had spent so much time worrying about others, I hadn't really thought about what I wanted. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could.